My girlfriend Emma and I had been together for 3 years, and to celebrate our anniversary, we decided to take a trip to a charming Airbnb loft in the heart of a historic city. The listing boasted beautiful views, modern amenities, and a perfect location. On October 21st, 2023, we arrived, excited for a romantic getaway. The loft was everything we had hoped for, spacious, with exposed brick walls and large windows that offered stunning views of the city. The building itself was over a century old, filled with history and character. We spent the first day exploring the city, enjoying the sights and sounds. That night we returned to the loft, tired but happy. We cooked a late dinner and settled in for the night, enjoying the cozy atmosphere. Little did we know our dream vacation was about to turn into a nightmare. Around midnight, we were awakened by a loud bang. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the kitchen. We rushed out of bed to investigate, but everything seemed normal. The windows were closed and there was no sign of an intruder. We chalked it up to the old building settling and went back to bed. But the disturbances continued. Throughout the night, we heard footsteps, creaking floorboards, and faint whispers. The loft grew colder, and we felt an eerie presence. Emma was particularly affected, waking up repeatedly, her face pale with fear. The next day, we decided to do some research on the building. We visited the local library and found old newspapers and records. To our horror, we discovered that the loft had a dark history. In the early 1900s, it had been the site of a gruesome murder-suicide. A man named Edward had killed his wife Clara and then himself. Their spirits were said to haunt the building, and several previous tenants had reported strange occurrences. We returned to the loft, feeling a mix of fear and determination. We needed to understand what was happening, and if possible, find a way to stop it. As we explored the loft, we found a hidden compartment behind one of the brick walls. Inside was an old, leather-bound diary, Clara's diary. That night, we read Clara's diary. Her entries detailed her unhappy marriage and Edward's descent into madness. She wrote about his violent outbursts and her fear for her life. The final entries were particularly chilling, describing how Edward had begun hearing voices and seeing apparitions. As we read, the disturbances in the loft grew more intense. The temperature dropped further, and the whispers became louder and more distinct. Objects moved on their own, and we saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners. Emma was particularly affected, feeling a constant, oppressive presence. In a desperate attempt to escape the hauntings, we decided to spend the night in a hotel. But as we packed our bags, the disturbances reached a climax. The lights flickered, and the air grew unbearably cold. We heard a loud crash, and the front door slammed shut. Edward's spirit appeared, a menacing figure with hollow eyes. He moved toward us, and the air was filled with Clara's terrified screams. We were trapped, and there seemed to be no way out. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed Clara's diary and began reading aloud her final entries. Edward's spirit recoiled, and the screams grew louder. The loft shook violently, and the temperature dropped further. The shadowy figure lunged at us, and we screamed. Feeling a cold, clammy hand grip my arm, somehow we managed to break free and escape the loft. We ran through the night, not stopping until we reached the safety of the hotel. Exhausted and shaken, we collapsed into bed, unable to believe what we had just experienced. The next day, we contacted the Airbnb host and reported everything. The host listened quietly, then told us that other guests had experienced similar disturbances but had never reported it. We left the city, vowing never to return. Years later, I still have nightmares about that weekend. The memory of Edward's hollow eyes and Clara's terrified screams haunts me. I've tried to forget, but every now and then, I hear those footsteps and whispers, and I'm transported back to that night in the haunted loft. It was December 3rd, 2022, when my best friend Jake and I decided to take a short vacation to unwind from our stressful jobs. We found an Airbnb listing that seemed perfect, a beautifully restored Victorian house located on the outskirts of a small town. The pictures showed a charming yet slightly eerie mansion with large windows and an expansive garden. The host, Mrs. Evelyn Moore, promised a peaceful retreat, ideal for a couple of city guys needing a break. We packed our bags and left early in the morning, excited for our little adventure. The drive took us through winding country roads lined with ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets to each other. As we approached the house, a chill ran down my spine. The mansion stood alone, surrounded by dense woods, its grandeur faded but still imposing. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle had started, making the scene even more atmospheric. Mrs. Moore greeted us at the door with a warm smile. She was an elderly woman, her eyes sharp, knowing. She gave us a quick tour, showing us the grand staircase, the vintage furniture, and the rooms we would be staying in. My room was on the second floor, while Jake's was across the hall. The rooms were spacious, with large windows that looked out onto the gloomy garden. Before leaving, Mrs. Moore gave us a few house rules: no going into the basement and no staying outside after dark. She said it in such a matter-of-fact way that we didn't question it at the time. We thanked her, and she left us to enjoy our weekend. After unpacking and settling in, Jake and I decided to explore the house. We wandered through the dimly lit hallways, admiring the antique decor. The house had a certain charm, but there was an underlying sense of unease that neither of us could shake. We spent the evening in the living room, talking and laughing, trying to ignore the creaking sounds that seemed to come from the walls. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from the window. I opened the curtains and looked out into the garden, but saw nothing. I shrugged it off as the wind and went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was Jake, but the footsteps were too heavy and deliberate. They seemed to be coming from the hallway. I got up and opened my door, peering into the dark corridor. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I felt a cold draft. I called out for Jake, but there was no response. I checked his room, and he was sound asleep. Feeling uneasy, I returned to my room and locked the door. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, I told Jake about the footsteps, but he laughed it off, saying it was probably just the old house settling. We decided to explore the nearby town and spent the day wandering through quaint shops and cafes. By the time we returned to the mansion, it was already getting dark. We had dinner in the grand dining room, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. As we were cleaning up, the lights flickered, and we heard a loud thump from upstairs. We exchanged nervous glances and decided to investigate. We found nothing unusual, but the sense of unease had intensified. We decided to stay in the living room, keeping the lights on and talking to keep our spirits up. Around midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly, and we heard a low whispering sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I looked at Jake, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We decided to go to bed, hoping that whatever was happening would stop if we ignored it. As I was lying in bed, I heard the tapping noise again, louder this time. I tried to block it out, but it was persistent. I got up and looked out the window again. This time, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden. The figure was tall and thin, its face hidden in the shadows. It stood motionless, staring up at my window. I felt a chill run down my spine and backed away from the window, closing the curtains. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I told Jake about the figure. He was visibly shaken but tried to stay rational. He suggested we leave the house and find a hotel in town. We packed our bags and were about to leave when Mrs. Moore arrived. She looked concerned and asked if everything was all right. We told her about the noises and the figure in the garden. Her face grew pale, and she told us that we needed to leave immediately. She explained that the house had a dark history. It had once belonged to a family who had all died under mysterious circumstances. Since then, strange things had been happening, and many guests had reported seeing the figure in the garden. She apologized for not telling us sooner and offered to refund our stay. We thanked her and hurried to our car. As we drove away, I looked back at the house and saw the figure standing on the porch, watching us leave. We found a small motel in town and checked in, feeling relieved to be away from the mansion. That night we tried to relax, but the sense of unease lingered. Around midnight there was a knock on our door. I got up to answer it, thinking it was the motel manager. When I opened the door, there was no one there. I stepped outside, looking around, but the hallway was empty. As I turned to go back inside, I saw the figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was the same tall, thin figure from the garden, its face still hidden in the shadows. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure started to move towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I backed into the room and slammed the door, locking it. Jake was already up, asking what was wrong. I told him about the figure, and we both grabbed our bags, deciding to leave immediately. As we hurried down the hallway, we saw the figure again, this time closer. It reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, clammy touch on my shoulder. I screamed and ran, dragging Jake with me. We made it to the car and sped off, not looking back. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were far away from the town. We found another motel and checked in, exhausted and shaken. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the tapping noise and seeing the figure in my mind. The next morning we decided to head home, cutting our vacation short. We reported the incident to Airbnb, but they were skeptical. We left a detailed review warning others about the house. A few days after returning home, I received a call from Mrs. Moore. She told me that she had decided to close the Airbnb listing and sell the house. She couldn't risk anyone else experiencing what we had. Jake and I tried to move on, but the experience left a lasting impact. Jake became increasingly withdrawn and paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. One night, I got a frantic call from him. He claimed to have seen the figure in his apartment. I rushed over to his place, but by the time I arrived, it was too late. I found Jake in his bedroom, his face frozen in terror. He was dead. The police ruled it as a heart attack, but I knew the truth. The figure had followed us, and it had taken Jake. It's been months since that fateful trip, and I still see the figure in my nightmares. I've moved to a new city, trying to start fresh, but the sense of dread never leaves me. I've tried to warn others, but most people think I'm crazy. I don't know what the figure is or why it's targeting us, but I'm certain that it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. If you ever find yourself in a quaint old house with a charming host, be wary. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and the dead don't stay dead.